There's a moment in every confusing connection where silence starts to speak louder than words, where distance begins to feel different, where something shifts but you can't quite explain it. Because when someone who usually pulls away starts moving closer in subtle, almost invisible ways, it's not random. It's not accidental. It's emotional. It's intentional in a way they may not even fully understand themselves. Love doesn't always show up loudly. Sometimes it hides behind hesitation, behind fear, behind patterns built to protect. And when those patterns begin to crack, when walls start to lower just a little, that's when the truth begins to reveal itself. If you've ever wondered whether their actions mean something deeper, whether the distance actually hides connection, then this is where clarity begins. Because when an avoidant starts doing certain things, it doesn't just mean change. It means love is trying to find its way through fear. When distance begins to transform into presence, even in the smallest ways, it carries a meaning that goes far deeper than what appears on the surface. There was once a pattern, silence, withdrawal, emotional unavailability that felt almost predictable. Space wasn't just a preference, it was a shield. But then something subtle starts to shift. The silence doesn't last as long. The distance doesn't feel as cold. There is a quiet return that wasn't there before. It may not come with explanation. There are no grand confessions or sudden emotional breakthroughs. Instead, it shows up in moments that are easy to overlook if you're not paying attention. A message that comes sooner than expected. A conversation that doesn't end abruptly. A presence that lingers just a little longer than usual. These are not random changes. They are intentional, even if they are not fully conscious. Because choosing to stay, even briefly, is not easy when every instinct says to leave. There is an internal conflict happening beneath the surface. One side is pulling toward safety, toward distance, toward the familiar comfort of emotional independence. The other side is being pulled toward connection, toward closeness, toward something that feels unfamiliar but deeply meaningful. And every moment of presence is the result of that inner tension. This is what makes it significant. It's not about perfection. It's not about suddenly becoming emotionally available overnight. It's about resistance to old patterns. It's about breaking habits that once felt necessary for survival. And when those habits begin to loosen their grip, it means something powerful is taking their place. Presence, in this sense, becomes effort. It becomes a choice made over and over again, even when it feels uncomfortable. There may still be moments of pulling back, moments where distance returns, but they no longer define the connection. Instead, they become part of a larger shift, a gradual movement towards something more stable, more connected, more real. What's important to understand is that this kind of change doesn't happen without reason. People do not challenge their own emotional defenses for something that doesn't matter. They don't step out of their comfort zone without feeling a strong internal pull. And that pull is often rooted in something deeper than logic. It's emotional. It's instinctive. It's connection. So when presence starts replacing distance, even in small, inconsistent ways, it's not something to dismiss. It's not something to question as coincidence. It's a signal. A quiet but powerful indication that something inside is shifting, that walls are not as strong as they once were, that the need to stay is beginning to outweigh the urge to leave. And in that space, between hesitation and effort, between fear and connection, is where something real begins to grow. When vulnerability begins to surface through carefully built emotional walls, it marks a turning point that cannot be faked or forced. There was once a strong sense of control. Every emotion filtered, every word measured, every personal detail kept at a safe distance. Openness didn't feel natural, it felt risky. So instead, there was protection. Silence replaced honesty. Distance replaced exposure. But then something changes. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in subtle, almost unnoticeable ways. A deeper conversation begins to emerge where there was once only surface-level exchange. Personal thoughts start slipping through, almost as if they weren't meant to be shared, yet they are. There's a shift from avoidance to expression, even if that expression feels incomplete or hesitant. These moments don't come easily. They often arrive wrapped in discomfort. There may be pauses, changes in tone, or even attempts to pull back right after opening up. That's because vulnerability in this context feels unfamiliar. It challenges the very system that was built to stay safe. And yet, despite that discomfort, it still happens. That's what makes it meaningful. It's not polished or confident, it's real. It's raw in a way that reveals internal conflict. A part that wants to remain guarded and another part that is slowly learning to trust. And trust, especially when it has not come easily in the past, is never given lightly. It is tested, questioned, and built piece by piece. When someone begins to share things that were once hidden, it's not just communication, it's exposure. It's allowing someone else to see parts that were once protected at all costs. Thoughts, fears, memories, insecurities. These are not things that get shared casually. They carry weight, they carry history, and revealing them requires a level of emotional risk that only happens when something truly matters. What's important to recognize is that vulnerability does not always look like emotional depth or long confessions. Sometimes it looks simple. It might be admitting uncertainty, expressing a feeling that isn't fully understood, saying something personal and then quickly changing the subject. These small cracks in the wall are where the truth begins to show. And even when there is hesitation afterward, even when there is a temporary retreat, it does not erase what was shared. In fact, it often reinforces it, because it shows that despite the instinct to close off again, there was still a moment where openness won. This is where connection starts to deepen. Not through perfection, but through authenticity. Not through constant openness, but through the willingness to try. Each moment of vulnerability becomes a step away from emotional distance and a step toward something more genuine. And no one moves in that direction without a reason. No one risks being seen, truly seen, unless there is a sense that it is safe enough or meaningful enough to do so. Because vulnerability is not just about sharing. It's about trusting that what is shared will be received, not rejected. So when those guarded layers begin to soften, even slightly, it's not something small. It's a quiet but powerful sign that emotional walls are no longer serving the same purpose. That connection is starting to feel more important than protection. And in that shift, from guarded to open, from distant to expressive, something real begins to take shape. When consistency begins to replace unpredictability, something subtle but deeply meaningful starts to unfold in the connection. It doesn't happen through a single defining moment. It happens gradually, almost invisibly, through repeated choices that begin to feel different from the past pattern. Where there was once uncertainty, messages that came and went without rhythm, emotional availability that felt like a moving target, there starts to be a shift toward steadiness. This steadiness doesn't mean perfection. It doesn't mean constant communication or uninterrupted emotional presence. Instead, it shows up in small but noticeable changes. Replies that don't disappear into silence for long stretches. Effort that doesn't feel entirely random anymore. A sense that even when distance happens, it is no longer disconnected from return. There is a pattern forming, even if it's still fragile. For someone who has lived inside emotional unpredictability, consistency is not just a behavior change, it is an internal adjustment. It means stepping away from the instinct to withdraw completely when things feel intense. It means resisting the urge to reset emotionally every time closeness becomes uncomfortable. And that resistance takes effort, real effort. At first, this consistency may still feel uneven. There may be days of warmth followed by moments of distance. But the difference is that the distance no longer feels like disappearance. It feels like processing. It feels like space without severing connection. And that distinction is important because it signals that attachment is forming in a way that is becoming harder to ignore. When someone begins to return consistently, even after moments of withdrawal, it shows that connection is no longer being treated as optional. It is becoming part of their emotional landscape, something they come back to rather than walk away from permanently. And that return, repeated over time, slowly builds trust, even if it is not spoken out loud. This shift is often internal before it is visible. The person may not even fully recognize why they are behaving differently. but something has changed in what they are willing to tolerate emotionally. The idea of disappearing completely no longer feels as natural as it once did. There is now a reference point, something that pulls them back. Consistency also changes the emotional dynamic of the connection. It reduces confusion. It softens anxiety. It creates space for understanding instead of constant interpretation. And in relationships where emotional unpredictability once created distance, this stability becomes a quiet form of reassurance. What makes this transformation significant is that it is not driven by obligation. It is driven by attachment. People do not maintain emotional consistency for something they are indifferent about. They only begin to stabilize their presence when something inside them starts to value the connection enough to protect it. Even small acts of consistency carry weight in this context. A message sent without delay. A conversation continued instead of abandoned. A return after silence that feels intentional rather than accidental. These are not dramatic gestures, but they are meaningful indicators of change. Over time, these patterns begin to replace old cycles of push and pull. The emotional rhythm becomes less chaotic, less uncertain. And in that steadiness, something new forms, a connection that is no longer defined by fear of closeness, but by the gradual acceptance of it. And that acceptance, built through consistency, becomes one of the clearest signs that something deeper is no longer being avoided, but quietly embraced. When protective independence starts to include another person instead of excluding them, it signals a profound internal shift that often goes unnoticed at first. For someone who has built their emotional world around self-sufficiency, control, and distance, independence is not just a lifestyle, it is identity. It is the foundation that says, I don't need anyone too close. It is safety, structure, and emotional regulation all in one. So when that structure begins to expand, even slightly, it is never accidental. At the beginning, independence looks untouched on the surface. Life continues as normal, decisions are still made alone, and personal space is still strongly protected. But something subtle begins to happen underneath. Thoughts start to include another person without permission. Simple decisions, what to do, what to say, how to respond, start carrying awareness of how they might affect someone else. This is the first quiet sign that emotional boundaries are shifting. It doesn't mean dependence is forming in a traditional sense. It means consideration is entering a space that was once entirely self-contained. And for someone who values emotional distance, consideration is not a small thing. It is the beginning of internal integration. It is the moment where me starts to occasionally include you. This shift can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because independence was built for protection, not connection. It was designed to avoid emotional entanglement, not to manage it. So when another person starts occupying mental space without invitation, it creates a subtle tension between old habits and new emotional awareness. At times, this change shows up in very simple behaviors. Choosing to share something that would normally be kept private. Thinking twice before making a decision that affects communication. Feeling the urge to check in, even when there is no external obligation to do so. These actions may seem small, but they represent something much deeper happening internally. The key transformation here is not loss of independence, it is expansion of it. Independence begins to stretch rather than shrink. It no longer exists solely as separation, but starts to coexist with connection. And this coexistence is not easy. It requires internal negotiation between comfort and vulnerability, between isolation and emotional involvement. What makes this stage important is that it is not driven by external pressure. No one is forcing this inclusion. It happens naturally when emotional significance crosses a threshold that can no longer be ignored. When someone becomes important enough, the mind begins to account for them even in moments of solitude. They become part of internal decision-making, even in silence. There is also a protective aspect to this shift. Instead of using independence to avoid emotional risk, it begins to be used more thoughtfully. Space is still valued, but it is no longer used as a tool to disconnect. It becomes a way to regulate rather than escape. And that difference is crucial. Over time, this gradual inclusion of another person into personal mental space changes the structure of the connection itself. It becomes less about separation and more about balance, less about avoiding influence and more about allowing presence without losing identity. And when someone who once lived entirely within their own emotional boundaries begins to make room mentally, emotionally, even subtly, it is not a loss of independence. It is the beginning of something more complex, independence that has learned how to hold connection without collapsing under it. When fear begins to reveal itself instead of hiding behind distance, it marks a deeply important emotional transition. Fear has always been there, but in earlier patterns, it operated silently, masked by withdrawal, silence, and emotional detachment. It was easier to disappear than to confront uncertainty, easier to shut down than to risk emotional exposure. But when fear starts showing itself instead of controlling behavior from behind the scenes, something significant is shifting. At first, it may not look like fear at all. It might appear as hesitation, overthinking, or sudden emotional sensitivity. There may be moments where responses become slower, not because of disinterest, but because thoughts are becoming heavier. Every interaction starts carrying weight. Every message, every silence, every change in tone begins to be analyzed internally. This is not confusion. It is emotional awareness becoming too strong to ignore. In earlier patterns, fear would have triggered disappearance, a need to create space, to reset emotionally, to regain control by stepping away. But now, instead of fully withdrawing, there is a pause, a moment of staying present even while discomfort exists. That pause is extremely meaningful because it shows resistance to old coping mechanisms. It shows that something inside is beginning to value connection more than avoidance. Fear in this stage is no longer just about discomfort. It becomes about significance, because fear only intensifies where emotional investment exists. No one fears losing something they don't care about. No one feels anxious about a connection that doesn't matter. The presence of fear itself becomes evidence that emotional attachment has already formed beneath the surface. This emotional fear can also create contradictions in behavior, a desire for closeness paired with sudden withdrawal, a moment of openness followed by hesitation, wanting connection but struggling with the vulnerability it requires. These contradictions are not signs of disinterest, they are signs of internal conflict between emotional pull and protective instinct. What makes this stage so complex is that fear is no longer just pushing someone away, it is also pulling them back. It creates a tension between staying safe and staying connected. And in that tension, decisions become slower, more deliberate, more emotionally loaded. Nothing feels casual anymore because everything feels like it matters more than before. Instead of escaping fear through distance, there is now an attempt, however imperfect, to sit with it, to understand it, to not let it immediately dictate behavior. This is where emotional growth begins to show itself. Not in the absence of fear, but in the ability to remain present despite it. Even small actions reflect this internal shift. A message sent despite uncertainty. A conversation continued even after emotional discomfort. A return after silence that feels thoughtful rather than automatic. These moments show that fear is still present, but it is no longer in full control. Over time, this change transforms how connection is experienced. Fear becomes less about avoidance and more about meaning. It becomes a signal rather than a barrier, a reminder that something emotionally important is at stake. And when fear starts to surface openly instead of silently controlling distance, it reveals something powerful. Emotional investment has reached a point where protection and connection are no longer separate forces. They are now struggling to exist in the same space. When effort becomes visible in a consistent, quiet, and intentional way, it reveals something far deeper than simple communication patterns. Effort is not just about what is done, it is about what is chosen repeatedly, even when there is no external pressure to do so. For someone who naturally leans toward emotional distance, effort does not appear easily. It has to pass through hesitation, through resistance, through internal questioning before it becomes action. At first, effort may seem minimal. Small gestures that might be easy to overlook if you are expecting something dramatic. A message sent without delay. A check-in that doesn't feel forced. A continuation of conversation instead of a disappearance into silence. These actions may appear simple on the surface, but in the context of emotional avoidance patterns, they carry significant weight. Because they are not driven by obligation, they are driven by internal choice. What makes this shift meaningful is repetition. One moment of effort could be accidental, but repeated effort begins to form a pattern, and patterns reveal intention. When someone who once struggled with emotional closeness starts showing up more consistently, it suggests that something within them is changing direction. They are no longer only responding to their instinct to withdraw, they are also responding to their desire to stay connected. Effort also shows up in attention, noticing details that were previously ignored, remembering small things that were said in passing, engaging more thoughtfully in conversations instead of keeping them at a surface level. These are not grand gestures, but they indicate that mental and emotional space is being allocated to the connection. And where attention goes, emotional significance follows. Another important aspect of this visible effort is its imperfection. It is not smooth or perfectly balanced. There may still be moments of distance, moments of hesitation, moments where old patterns briefly return. But what matters is not the absence of inconsistency, it is the presence of return. The willingness to come back into connection after stepping away. Effort in this form often feels unspoken. It is not always verbalized or explained. Instead, it is expressed through behavior, through presence, through the decision to engage again even after internal resistance. And this is where its authenticity becomes clear. Because forced effort eventually fades, but emotionally driven effort tends to resurface again and again. Over time, this pattern begins to reshape the dynamic of the connection. What once felt uncertain starts to feel more stable. What once felt confusing begins to feel more readable. The emotional distance does not disappear completely, but it loses its dominance. Effort starts to replace absence as the default response. This is especially significant because effort requires energy. Emotional energy, cognitive energy, the willingness to override instinctive withdrawal. And no one consistently invests that kind of energy into something that feels meaningless. Even when it is not fully understood internally, the behavior itself reveals value. And perhaps the most important part of visible effort is this. It is not about perfection, but persistence. It is about choosing connection more often than avoidance, choosing presence more often than disappearance, choosing engagement even when emotional comfort is not guaranteed. When effort becomes a pattern instead of a rare moment, it stops being just behavior. It becomes a signal, a quiet but powerful indication that something within is no longer standing still. It is moving, it is softening. It is learning that staying connected, even imperfectly, is worth more than stepping away.